Welcome to the latest episode of A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions, The Wave of the Future podcast series. From London, I'm Helen Clegg, and my guest today is Tim Kemp, also speaking from the UK. In today's podcast, Tim shares with us 5 key concepts for building innovative teams. In a world where innovation is needed more than ever before, where companies are struggling with globalization, virtual teams, and the challenges of distance, the ability to build innovative teams will set organizations apart and enable them to be more competitive. Tim is a senior consultant with Global Novations, a company which provides services to clients around diversity and inclusion, talent and market optimization. Tim is an experienced and respected advisor and a writer on management learning, and has a particular interest in the way we seem determined to build organizations that stifle innovation and punish creativity. He's also rather keen to do something about it. Over the most recent past, Tim has been invited to work on a range of organizational development and action learning projects that have measurably benefited organizations wrestling with the consequences of often unexpected change. He's worked across a wide range of sectors and with organizations across Europe, the Middle East, and in the US, including A.T. Kearney, GlaxoSmithKline, the Council of Europe, and The Economist, to name but a few. Tim completed a master's degree in education in 1985 and a master's degree in business administration at the London Business School in 1990. He's a Chartered Fellow of the Institute of Personnel and Development, a Fellow of the Chartered Management Institute, and a Visiting Fellow at Bristol Business School in the UK. Tim, welcome to our podcast. I want to begin by asking you about responsible autonomy, as I know this is one of the key concepts you stress is necessary for building innovative teams. What, in your view, is responsible autonomy, and how do organizations start to get to grips with this concept?
Oh, thank you, Helen. It's really good to be here. Responsible autonomy, it seems to me to be that there's a tension between administration, control, if you like, and autonomy. The two don't sit comfortably together in organizations. Professionals, understandably, have very high expectations that they'll be allowed to get on with whatever it is they've been trained to do. And yet organizations seem determined to find ways of frustrating them. Scientists often talk about how order and form are created not by complex controls, but by the presence of a few guiding formulas, a few guiding principles that are expressed through the exercise of individual freedom. I mean, think of those marvelous swirling clouds of starlings that you see sometimes of an evening. There are a few guiding principles like don't smack into your neighbor and follow the bird in front of you. And with those principles, they create original aerial symphonies every night. The survival of systems, whether it's multinational organizations or microbial organisms, depends on identifying a few key principles and then allowing for high levels of autonomy from individuals within that system. Now, of course, the flip side of this is that we professionals need to take our role and our responsibility as innovators seriously. That means we need to commit to being curious, commit to our learning and our own professional development, commit to trying to improve things, commit to collaborating. It means experimenting and risking failure, and then sharing what we've learned. Arie de Geus, the old planning director from Shell, who wrote The Living Company, he once wrote that successful organizations need to run experiments in the margins. Run experiments so that they have an ever-evolving bank of experiences to bring to unpredictable and a turbulent world. Now, responsible autonomy means it'll be professionals that are the ones that are imagining, devising, running, learning from, and reporting back on those experiments.
Tim, I love the image of starlings swirling in a formation in the night sky to illustrate how people need only a few guiding principles to practice responsible autonomy, although my guess is that it's easier said than done. Now, in your presentations and speeches, you talk about the need for organizations to show that they're really serious about innovation if they're to be successful in building these innovative teams. So how can organizations demonstrate that they've grasped this concept, Tim?
Well, it's a really good question, Helen. The organizations need to demonstrate this by demonstrating a complete commitment and support for innovation from the corporate top. Top leaders need to demonstrate the kinds of behavior that will encourage innovation and nurture collaboration between employees. And that includes making sure that the reward and the recognition system doesn't undermine collaboration and experimentation. I read a piece of research from the Hay Group a while ago that pointed out that 43% of leaders in technology companies actually destroy value. They destroy value by creating demotivating work climates for their teams. Now that's unacceptable. We need to make sure that we're giving people their power back. Now, this is not about empowerment, nice though the concept is. I'm actually talking about making sure that we don't take power away in the first place. We need to give people permission to do things differently. People are trained, they're intelligent, they've got ideas. We need to give them the opportunity to try things out. Leaders need to move away from commanding people to do things to inspiring them to do things.
Have you got an example to illustrate that?
Absolutely. There's a senior vice president of a large global client in a highly regulated sector, and he used to invite staff to demonstrate intelligent disobedience. That's a lovely concept. He wanted them to challenge crazy rules and procedures, to challenge lazy thinking or unethical practice. He wanted them to challenge poor quality or dismal customer service. And he used this notion of intelligent disobedience. Now, the important thing about this is that it came from the top.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I have to admit, I really like the idea of not following the rules. And I guess to qualify that, that means, those crazy rules that you're just talking about. So rules that are crazy really do need to be challenged. Tim, what's another example of how organizations can support innovation?
Well, there's another good example from a client of ours. They've developed a really neat little technique for keeping themselves fresh. Now, often in business, we get into the habit of doing things in a certain way just because it's always been done that way. They call their technique rewind. And what it says very simply is that every time people realize that they've been doing something the same way 3 times, no matter what it is, they're encouraged to ask questions like, is this still appropriate? Is this still working? Could we be doing it any better? Is there another way we could be doing it? It may well be that everything is optimal and absolutely fine, but you won't know for sure unless you stop, look around, and wonder a little bit.
Right, and that's a really simple technique, Tim, that you just mentioned there and illustrate with that story. And I'm sure it could be practiced by many teams or departments, with immediate effect as well. Tim, what's the third concept for building innovative teams in an organization from your perspective?
Well, in a way, it's linked to the last one, but it's more specific. It's about removing distractions, focusing on outcomes rather than on processes. We're very good at measuring things. Somebody once said, what is measured gets managed. So this is about letting go of the need to over-manage, over-monitor, over-process. There are often many paths to achieving a result. So unless you are absolutely sure that your process will never be improved upon, and that it's the only possible way of achieving the best possible outcome, then loosen the shackles a bit. The more systems we impose, the more processes we leave unchallenged, the less innovation we're going to see. Compliance and conscientiousness, nice though they are as behaviors, are not behaviors that are fundamental to innovation.
And Tim, do you have an example you can share with us to illustrate how organizations can get completely bogged down in focusing on these processes rather than the outcomes?
Yes, I do. This was the story of a chief executive I worked with many years ago who was embarking on the need for home working and allowing people to work from home, flexible working hours. This didn't sit comfortably with him. And he was very concerned that people would not be working when they were supposed to. So he decided to see if there was some software fix he could purchase that allowed him to see whether or not people were logged on, which of course was possible. But he wasn't satisfied with that because, of course, people might be logged on, but they might have gone off to play golf in the meantime. So he decided to invest in even more software that would measure keystrokes. But then, of course, that wasn't good enough because he didn't know what a good benchmark was. So he had to set benchmarks of performance. And the whole process became layers upon layers upon layers of distraction. And it was a huge exercise in undermining trust, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute.
But Tim, that whole story is in some ways very scary because if you're monitoring what employees are typing, I mean, the keystrokes, they could be writing anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're generating any new ideas or actually doing any work. So, in some ways, that was a totally futile exercise, right?
Completely, but he gave him a wonderful sense of being in control.
Right, right. And so, moving on to talk about the concept of trust, which you just mentioned, in our discussions previously, you talked about the fact that trust is really another of those key concepts. So, can you share with our audience your perspective on the concept of trust?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, this is fundamental. Innovation demands a high degree of trust. We need to believe that people are out there doing things for the best possible reasons. It's a major concept and a massive challenge to organizations today. My professor and old friend Charles Handy once said that trust needs touch. It's important to recognize that although we have marvelous technology that enables us to work virtually from home, from an airport lounge, from the beach, we're still humans, and humans are social creatures. We can't build good relationships or good organizations on electronic networks alone. And trust, when we're talking about innovation, makes the biggest difference. If you don't trust employees, then they'll just focus on their own security, on protecting themselves, rather than being innovative. They'll use that wonderful ability, that huge amount of brain power to make sure that they don't get caught, or they're not going to be blamed, or their back is covered.
Right, right.
If you want to foster an innovative culture, people need to trust that they will be treated respectfully and they won't be penalized for thinking creatively or taking calculated risks.
So, trust is really vital to human relationships, and ultimately, an organization is a network of human relationships. So, trust has to be there. It has to be almost the cornerstone of the organization. But Tim, I'm sure many companies will struggle with it as a concept.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it doesn't mean that it's not worth doing.
Oh no, no, no! I totally agree. But I think that it's a very, very hard concept to implement and allow to happen. So, Tim, as we come towards the end of this podcast, my final question to you is about the fifth key concept for building innovative teams. What, in your view, is the fifth concept that organizations need to embrace to make sure that they build innovative teams?
Well, it's about building vibrant and diverse networks. You have to have a rich source of ideas, a rich source of experiences. Employees need to build their networks so that they have a seam of perspectives to draw from. Notice I mentioned perspectives, not just ideas. We need perspectives. We need. I think it was Marcel Proust who once said that the most wonderful journey in the world is not to see 100 countries through one pair of eyes, but rather to see one country through 100 pairs of eyes. And it's the same with innovation. We need to see a problem through 100 pairs of eyes. So what I'm encouraging people to do is cast their nets widely, to mix with lots of different people and treat themselves to new experiences. Tim Smith, the creative force behind the Eden Centre in Devon, used to challenge his staff to watch films, attend theatre, read books that they wouldn't normally read, at least once a month, and then to talk to others about them. Most employees are specialists of one sort or another, and they often find it difficult to be challenged by someone with a different perspective or a different background. We're not comfortable being challenged by people with different perspectives. It takes a certain courage and humility to recognize that different perspectives could actually revolutionize one of our own cherished processes.
Right, and I think also what it means is that, someone who challenges your idea or your process, they're challenging you and taking you out of your comfort zone as well, and that can be very uncomfortable.
It can indeed, but it's essential.
I totally agree. And Tim, do you have an illustration or an example of what you have referred to as a naive insight, where someone comes across a different perspective that can challenge their way of thinking and actually improve the process that they already have in place?
I certainly do. It's a lovely story about an obstetrician and a visit to a local zoo. It's from Stephen Johnson's great little book, Where Good Ideas Come From. I heartily recommend it. This story is about a Parisian obstetrician named Stéphanie Tarnier in the late 1870s. And he took a day off from work at the Maternité de Paris, which was a lying-in hospital for the city's poor women. And he paid a visit to the nearby Paris Zoo. And he saw the elephants and the reptiles and the gardens and so on. But he came across a selection of chicken incubators. And he saw the little hatchlings tottering around in the incubator, the warmth of the incubator. And this triggered an association in his head. And before long, he'd hired the zoo's poultry raiser to construct a device that would perform a similar function for human newborns. And this was the first case ever of an incubator being created for human beings. And it was so successful in reducing the infant mortality rate that the legislature in Paris decreed that incubators were to be used in all of the city's maternity hospitals within a few years. Just a wonderful example of association.
Tim, that's a really great story about the obstetrician and the zoo and how two completely different views can improve on a process.
It's lovely, but it requires that we get over our fear of expertise, of losing control. We need a little bit more humility sometimes to realize that we can actually learn from others that have a completely different perspective and background.
Right, and I think, you touched there on another important point, and that's the fact that people need humility, and that is another incredibly hard thing to practice. Maybe the Dalai Lama could give us some insight there, but that will be the topic of another podcast. Tim, thank you very much for your insight. It's been an incredibly interesting podcast and conversation with you today. So to wrap up, the 5 key concepts for building innovative teams that Tim has shared with us are trust, building vibrant and diverse networks, focusing on outcomes rather than processes, support from the corporate top, and responsible autonomy. Now, Tim, that sounds like an incredibly tall order for organizations to implement. In a nutshell, do you think companies can change, especially the large ones?
I think it's essential, Helen. I don't think there's any alternative. For me, it boils down to finding the small within the big. Obviously, we want economies of scale, and big organizations are very commonplace. But we need to find the small within that, the centers of innovation. We need to develop almost guerrilla techniques to find cells, innovative cells within organizations. We need to encourage them and support them. We need to create an environment that liberates people, liberates ideas and liberates people. We need to move away from unhelpful processes and recognize that it's okay to fail. If we allow autonomy, then we're going to have to expect that there will be experiments, and some of those experiments won't work, but we'll learn from them. I would ultimately love to see managers as liberators of talent, of potential, of ideas, rather than just gatekeepers and hall monitors.
And on that note of liberation, that brings us to the end of this podcast on building innovative teams. I'm Helen Clegg in London, and I'd like to thank very much Tim Kemp for being my guest today. I'd also like to thank our production engineer Tom Klein in San Francisco. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Wave of the Future. If you have any comments on this podcast, please tweet them. Our Twitter handle is @ATKPAS. This has been an A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions podcast production. Join us again next time for The Wave of the Future, and remember, sharing knowledge is powerful.